Good evening, Tigard. Mayor Jason Snider here with Police Chief Kathy McAlpine. And I want to first thank our community for a significant level of engagement in the last couple of weeks, and particularly since our last chat, with both feedback, questions, and lots of community dialogue that I really appreciate. I want to talk about that for a moment to begin with. The dialogue that I had challenged everybody to provide in our community, to provide me and the city council with feedback about the processes we might use to move forward. And just a little update on that, I've received more than 100 different communications from individuals within our community. Most of them have been specific about things that they think should happen, or things that should change, or things they want us to look into, but not specifically about process. And so the city manager and I, along with the leadership team and the city council, are going to be working through how to navigate the next steps with this work, because we didn't get a lot of process input, and that's okay. I also want to be very sensitive to the fact that we don't want to be through this. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, and that is not work that we should be putting on the communities that have been disadvantaged and negatively impacted by institutional racism and systemic racism over centuries and decades. So we're going to be sensitive to that, but we also need a lot of input and information, and so that's a delicate balance, how we actually achieve that while getting the right level of input, or as maximum amount of input that people want to give, but also not burdening people unnecessarily and expecting the communities that have been disadvantaged to fix everything, because that doesn't make any sense, and it puts an undue burden on that community. So I made some notes from the Fireside chat last week as I was kind of debriefing myself and thinking about some of the feedback that we got and information. And I guess the first thing I want to mention is an acknowledgement. I had talked a fair bit at the beginning of last week's chat about why certain protected classes were not included in my statement, and that had upset some individuals, and I had shared, I think last week it even resulted in me crying, sharing information about why that was. What I think is important to acknowledge, and I want to mention right up front, is that I completely recognize, and I think the city recognizes, the intersectional issues with, for example, people that are in our Black community and transgender, or in our Black community and gay or bisexual, or those types of folks are even at greater risk in our society right now, and I think that's well documented. And I'm not going to make the broad case for that now, but I want to recognize that my focus on people of color in particular, and trying to eliminate systemic racism around that, does not negate the fact that there are intersectional issues that absolutely have to be addressed as we're doing the work. And it also doesn't mean that LGBTQIA plus issues are not important or things that the city needs to continue to be working on. So I wanted to just recognize that right up front. I also briefly want to talk about the structure of our city government, which, people may be, bored by. This may be the end of you watching tonight if you find that boring, but in this time, I think it's important because people are, I think many residents have perhaps a misunderstanding about my role as mayor, the role of the city council, the way our governance of our city is set up. And so I'm going to give you like a 30-second lesson on that to make sure you understand my relationship, for example, to the police chief. So in Oregon, in all cities in Oregon, with the exception of Beaverton currently, and they've just voted to change this, we have what is called a mayor and council form of government with a city manager. So I do not run the day-to-day operations of the city, and neither does the mayor of any city in Oregon. Portland's it's its own animal, and you can read about that in national media if you want to read about their governance structure. But in our city, we have a city manager, and her name is Marty Wine. She serves as the chief executive of the city. She is the police chief's direct supervisor.
Correct.
And so I think it's important to make sure that our community understands that dynamic right now, and the fact that I actually am not the person who hires and fires the police chief. So just, if you have more questions about that, let us know. The city charter is pretty clear on this, and it's not that long. It's only a few pages long. The city charter is essentially the city constitution, and that is going to be the extent of my civics lesson on the way the city is set up tonight, unless you have additional questions. So wanted to make sure that everybody understands those structures as we're continuing to have this dialogue. Chief, did you have any opening remarks or follow-up that you wanted to do from things that you've heard in the last week?
Well, nothing prepared, but thank you for the opportunity. I too want to just express my appreciation for the number of questions and comments that I have also received or have come in through the city's website, and actually the outreach has been in a lot of different forums, both asking very, very detailed, specific questions. Equally, I've received a huge number of outpouring of support, whether it's stopping by and notes, kids saying thank you for protecting us. A lot of people in Tigard saying how the relationship they've had for many years, and I just want to say thank you for the support. It's a tough time for our profession, and while we have to have these conversations and we need to look at how we police, it is appreciated by our officers the level of support that hopefully they're being evaluated by the merits of their personal performance and not maybe somebody who did something in the Midwest. So again, just appreciate the opportunity to answer questions, and we'll continue the dialogue for many more days to come.
So some other things that had come up as I was reflecting last week and hearing some feedback, got a lot of comments about citizen review board and oversight of our police department, and right now there is not a structure with a citizen review component. There's been a number of pieces of feedback and information about that, and certainly it's something that's going to get more attention and scrutiny, because we are getting a lot of feedback about it. Chief, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that, if that's a practice that's been discussed among the police chiefs, how it might operate, or any thoughts you might have.
Early on, I did have a meeting with the Washington County chiefs, and that was not the topic of discussion. It was more, how are we listening as a collective group with our communities, and really not jumping too far ahead, but just really taking in what the concerns are and the requests. A lot of them have also done the 8 can't wait comparison with their elected officials. What I will say is, coming from Tacoma, we did have a citizen oversight, so I'm familiar with that type of structure, and have often had to report out when I was in charge of internal affairs, and so I'm familiar with it in actual context.
Okay. Another thing that we got, actually, I want to acknowledge that over the last week I have spent a fair bit of time learning about and studying the requests and the language around defunding the police, and the desire by some to see change there. And I want to acknowledge that what I've learned over the last week, and I'm going to continue to be learning, is that that is a huge call and recognition that our social services as a country, particularly mental health and other support systems for addiction, homelessness, etc., are severely underfunded.
That is correct.
And that's been, that is 3 or 4 decades in the making at least. And what I want to acknowledge about that is that if you talk with or listen to officers, both in Tigard and around the broader community, they'll readily admit that responding to some or many of these types of calls that have become their responsibility as there is no one else to, the policing structures in our country never said, oh yeah, we want to be in that business. Everybody else stepped back in the form of not being funded anymore. Those are decisions that were made by, political leaders and the structure of how all of our governments over the last 30 or 40 years have chosen to act on some of those things. And I think it's interesting that there's an acknowledgement clearly, and has been actually, I think, from the law enforcement community that's not where you do your best work. And it's not where you have the focus of your training. And so I guess what I want to share is that I've heard that message loud and clear as well. During the mayoral campaign a couple years ago, I actually had quite a bit of conversation with Chief McAlpine about whether or not we wanted to, when we were debating how we wanted to move forward with some of our support, we discussed whether or not we wanted to hire a social worker or two in lieu of hiring a couple police officers. The idea was, and this is modeled, we're not making this up, this is not something I dreamed up, but there's a unit in Washington County that has a mental health professional teamed up with sheriff's deputies, and they actually respond in some cases to calls in our community, I believe. But that, that's a concept that it's not foreign to us, and it's been a dialogue we've had in some ways. But I think what this tells me, and what I've heard in the last week, is that we need to really dig into that a lot deeper and be thinking about how, as a community, a city, a state, we are going to address those types of issues and maybe not make them be police issues. If you don't want a police officer trying to de-escalate someone with a serious mental health crisis or a suicidal veteran, then we shouldn't be sending them to those calls, as an example. We should have resources and systems in place in our country to take care of those people appropriately. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that was just a lot of talking on my part.
No,
Sorry.
I absolutely concur. And again, when I came to the council asking for more resources, it is because we're the de facto person to have to handle these. And there are little to no resources within the city of Tigard. A lot of it has to go to a hospital outside of Tigard. Mental health professionals are outside of Tigard. And so even more so here, we're having to. And as I've always said, about 64 to 67% of our calls for service have some sort of mental health or substance abuse component to that. Some are still criminal, but others are just behavioral health issues. And that's what's driving a good majority of our calls for service. And it takes time. It takes time to de-escalate them, to get them calmed down, to see if they want help. If they don't and they're a danger to themselves, we could be at a hospital for 2 or 3 hours. And again, that means we're not available to handle those other calls for service where a crime may be in progress. So definitely is a national topic, and the resources, across the country, police have been the de facto go-to entity to handle these.
So a couple last thoughts and then we'll start going. I see the chat and the questions are hitting hard, so I want to get to those. But a couple follow-ups from last week. There were a lot of questions and comments about the rates of use of force in Tigard, and you commented a bit on that. And there's a very low rate of use of force.
0.14%.
Yeah, very low rate. Recognizing that doesn't mean that the next incident couldn't be a catastrophic
of course,
crisis and result in something none of us would want. But I do think that there are state rates available, and Chief, I don't know if you know this, but I'm going to share it with our community, just to give everybody an idea of how much our state has to make some progress on. Our use of force rates against people of color is 4 times higher than it is for whites in our country, or in our state, excuse me. And that's concerning to me. It certainly suggests something's going on. What I will point out is that Oregon, even though it's 4 times greater, many states were, 15 times higher. So that is not to say Oregon's doing well, but it just suggests that there's a lot of work to do everywhere. The last comment I'll make before we get to your questions and the things that we've received emails about was that I had a couple people point out that a lot of the feedback, at least last week, about the school resource officers and the questions were actually coming, some Facebook sleuths notified me of this, were all coming from people that weren't from Tigard, which I thought was interesting. And I guess what I want to make sure everybody knows is that we need to be having a conversation about what is right for the people of Tigard and the people of color who live in Tigard, and taking care of our own community. So while I don't want to dismiss all of that, it is also important that we're balancing at some points in time whether we're getting information that is specific about Tigard and about what's right for our community. So let's hop to some questions. Let's see if I can get them. Not getting them on my iPad right now. Let's go to.
You have one right up
Got a couple up here.
Got one up here.
Yeah.
2 up here.
Let's see. We need to make sure we get to the ones we didn't do last week. But let's start. We've got Jimmy Brown regarding appropriation of city dollars. Is the city looking at ways to appropriate dollars that may positively impact its communities of color, specifically Black, Latino, Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian? Jimmy, that is absolutely part of the conversation. In fact, in my discussion with the city manager today, when we were trying to figure out how to move forward, one of the things that we talked about and that I'm suggesting, and Chief, this will probably be news to you, but that's okay, is that we start with the outcomes that are disparate right now in our communities, and that we then work backwards from those. So Jimmy, that would result in changes in potentially all kinds of different ways that the city would be appropriating dollars differently. If we want to see different health disparity outcomes, if we want to see different rate, or not different, we want to see similar rates of home ownership and generational wealth, and those kinds of ultimate outcomes. Is absolutely going to mean that we've got to do different things in the short term, medium term, and long term. Let's see, Jeff, what is Tigard's status on qualified immunity? Also, when will the full police force wear body cameras? Chief, I know you briefly talked about body cameras last week. Can you speak to both of those, qualified immunity and to the full police force wearing body cameras?
Well, qualified immunity is an opportunity for anybody doing this profession, and then to have the full support of a city or an entity to support them should they be accused of doing something wrong. And they followed all policies, all procedures, their training. They deserve the right to be supported by the full legal staff of a city entity. So there's a lot of discussion around the country on that, and I believe most have backed off from that, realizing just how important that is, or else, there's nobody that's going to want a police.
We wouldn't have any police officers?
Exactly. As far as when the full police force will wear body cameras, again, that's a discussion for the city manager and talking to the council on where that funding, because right now it's not in the upcoming budget, so we have to identify where we're going to get the funding, because it's not cheap. But I'm hearing enough.
Will you tell us how much? What do you estimate? I know you priced it out for the budget committee, or we started to. But
yeah,
what is
it's about $140,000 a year. It's the software. Now, the good thing is a good part of that expense was staffing to download all of it, to get it into
Manage
the
it.
evidence, the cloud. And because the levy passed, one of the add-ons was a property and evidence person who would be tasked with doing that. So we actually, because of the levy, we actually have the staffing we would need. So then it just becomes,
The equipment and
purchasing.
technology.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that is something we're looking at currently and seeing when we can implement that and make those decisions.
So we have a comment here from Dolly. She urges all citizens of Tigard to ask, how can I help? Instead of sitting back and just pointing out all of our government's shortcomings. Thank you, Dolly. I appreciate that comment. Let's go to a couple questions. We had one email last week that somebody was frustrated that we didn't get to their questions. So let's make sure we get to those. Let's see. In the next community meeting and in general, they would like to discuss the following. What it would take to pair Tigard police officers with trained mental health professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take that one. We kind of talked about that already.
It was a proposal for the levy.
Yep.
You're absolutely correct.
It was it was a possibility. It's not what we ended up moving forward with.
Right.
We talked about that a bit, about why, and I think it's important for the community to know what kind of dialogue goes along with that. Part of what we were discussing was, did it make sense to pair someone that was perhaps more helpful to members of our community who are homeless, as an example. I'm going to use this as an example, not that this is the only area that we would need social support in. But in that dialogue, the chief made it clear to me that even if I was asking the question about whether we could avoid hiring a police officer and hire a social worker or a mental health professional. And what she shared with me from a safety perspective is, at least the way our systems are set up now, we would not dispatch a police officer on their own by themselves to a call like that. They would have an officer that was backing them up, and therefore we weren't talking about exchanging an officer for a mental health professional or a social worker. We were talking about adding another resource. So that's the extent of the conversation so far. We need to clearly talk more about
and
this.
it's more of a model, right, where Washington County Mental Health has said they'll come out if they will have an officer paired. So we do it on a limited basis, maybe one day every couple of weeks, and so it's a partnership. So there is the security, but it's also, we have the professional with us. And on those days, it's been very successful. So while we're deciding or building maybe a social service system, that is another bridge that we can talk about to again properly address the issues we're facing in Tigard.
Yeah, and if we figure out how to do that, we can potentially, if we're not sending police officers to all those calls, we may ultimately need fewer police officers. But what I want to make sure of is that system's in place before we start saying we're not going to have anybody to respond.
Right.
So that's important.
And we still need the resources. We still need to have the places to go. If they're backed up and they're just returning people back into our city with no help, and
that's not helpful either.
That is not. We're just spinning our wheels then.
So I think this is a good time to make a point about how interconnected and interdependent all of this is, and that we're going to need huge help from the state and the federal government as well. The mental health system in particular is very state and county driven, funded, focused, and coordinated. And so that means that there's got to be a lot of intergovernmental cooperation to work on some of these issues. The other topic this person had raised and really wanted to talk about was the school resource officers. And I want to make sure that our community knows that we are very aware. There's been conversations both with the school district and with the students at our high schools, and even with the leader of the Black Student Union at Tigard High School, that we need to have a conversation about the school resource officers. I've received not only a lot of feedback, but also questions and concern from some students. Many students support the program. Some have questions about it. And what we're not going to do, and you're not going to hear us do tonight, is say, we're ending that program. This needs to be a community discussion. School doesn't start until September at the earliest when we would have school resource officers back in schools in person, and even then it looks like the guidance from the state that may not look like a normal school year, but we need to make the right decisions for our community. We need to have a robust dialogue, and there is nothing, because of when the school cycle is, I don't want to risk our community making a knee-jerk, fast, potentially not well thought through decision for our own community. And we need to make sure we hear from everybody. And by we, I'm talking the community. So we're going to partner with the school district. I believe we're going to have neutral professional facilitation that is not from the city or from the school district. Make sure that everyone that wants to have a seat at the table has a seat at the table for those discussions. And I think we can commit that before the school year starts, we will get to the right decision for our community as a community. This is not something where the 5 city councilors or the police chief is just going to make the decision on their own. I guess I should say the 5 members of the city council. There's 4 councilors and myself. Sorry, got to make sure I'm accurate here. Chief, do you want to add anything on the SROs?
Again, I just reiterate, we've been in communication with Dr. Sue, and I just want to say that she too doesn't want to do this in a vacuum, so she does want to hear from the students. She wants to hear from parents and make a thoughtful decision, and I think that is important to do. Our school resource officer was just at the middle school's graduations today, and many parents thanked Officer Marion for his presence and what he's done. Officer Imus was present and asked to attend. He's a school resource officer for Tigard High School, so when the students did a peaceful march from Tualatin to Tigard, he was part of that. They've even had graduation ropes with his name on it, on
wow.
Memorying, just his 4 years of service and the impact. And so I think, that not only is a question of should we have school resource officers, but also could it look a little different? So I think everything's on the table so that as students bring some input, we may have school resource officers, but maybe they are in a softer uniform, or maybe they do something else. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue and the collaboration, and I'm hoping that it's, we can see that happen in the next month.
So from an email we received beforehand, one of the questions is, can we see a monetary breakdown of where funds from the recently approved levy will be going? I can start answering this, and then the chief can get more specific. We had 3 things in the levy funded. One was a full-time school resource officer. Again, we just talked about how that may be reevaluated. We had 8 additional patrol officers. So all the equipment, training, and vehicles, etc., that they would need to be on patrol. That added specifically 1 patrol officer to each shift each day. That was the idea there, and why it was 8. And then the last, which this person specifically calls out, and so we'll cover in a little more detail, is what is really included in the de-escalation training. This person said claiming it will go towards de-escalation training is not enough. So let's talk about the specific plan. The plan was over a short period of time in the next year or 2 to get every single sworn officer through advanced de-escalation and crisis intervention training, which is currently 40 hours per officer of training. That was included in the levy. If I recall the amount of money, that was about, I can remember it was about a cent out of the 29 cents per thousand.
2% of the total.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2% of the total levy was covering that.
Mm-hmm.
And the school resource officer, you remember what percent that was exactly? It would have been, I guess it would have been about 1.
A little bit more, yeah.
Yeah. So probably a couple percent or a little bit more than that. So I hope that answers the question about the levy. The other comment was Chief McAlpine wants us to understand that our police department is not the same as the others, like Portland using excessive force. Then we want to actually see that our police officers are different. So I think we tried to address that a little bit, but I also want to acknowledge that, you know, I think this is very fair for us to acknowledge and be cognizant of, that right now we could have an incident that escalated and resulted in an outcome that we would really not want to see, and that would be just as concerning. I mean, we want to think that we're not going to be that agency and that city, but I think it's important to acknowledge right now, with the way our structures are set up in our country, I honestly think it could happen.
Well, just the nature of our business
Right.
makes us vulnerable. And, you know, the last polling we did, which was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half, we had a 96% approval rating at, you know, from a survey. So again, who participated? It's random. It was done by a third-party entity. So 96%. I think that in itself tells you where our starting point is. We have the trust of the community. I've seen the outpouring now. Does that mean we're perfect? Absolutely not. Does that mean we can do things better for all of Tigard residents? Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's important that here's something that happened in the Midwest is now how fragile trust can be broken or questioned, let's put it that way, by something that didn't even happen in Tigard, but by the sheer nature of our profession, that we're being asked the same things and we're being looked at. And so I think, Mayor, you said it spot on. We have to keep proving ourselves every day, doing a professional job. That's what I've asked the men and women of the Tigard Police Department. Keep doing what you do. And if you think there's an opportunity to do it a little bit better, you do that. Whether that's through communication, thoughtfulness, taking time to answer people's questions out in the field, I'm asking them to do that. And but again, our starting point was very high compared to some of those other agencies we're seeing across the country.
So the other comment from this gentleman was that he wanted me to do more research on defunding the police. We talked about that earlier. I think we've discussed that at least as much as we can right now, unless we get specific additional questions about it. But I will acknowledge that I did my homework from over the last week on that. So let's get to some of the questions that have been coming in. Mike has a question. Please address misconduct complaints. Many law enforcement agencies around the country are reviewing past complaints and body cam footage. Will Tigard be reviewing past incidents to ensure that officers handle themselves appropriately? If so, will you release the findings? Chief.
Well, let me first talk about, you know, misconduct, and that can come from any different source. It can be anonymous, it can come to the police department, it can come to the mayor or an elected official or the city manager. We take all complaints, even if they're anonymous, and we review them. So there's an internal review. Now, obviously, if there's a criminal element to that, then you have the DAs involved as well. So we take all complaints, we investigate them, find witnesses, see if there are any video and things of that nature. I see all complaints at the end. The recommendations, I make the ultimate decision, and those are maintained every year and don't go away. As far as going to past complaints and body cam footage, or for us it would be dash cameras, no. No, I haven't even thought about that. Mind you, I'm still in the intake of hearing what the community wants, what is expected.
You've now heard that. So
I've now
you'll
heard
take that in.
So yes. But if you're asking me if I'm doing it right now, no. But you know, everything's on the table as far as what we can look at, and again, to give a level of confidence by the community.
So let's see, Kevin, Chief McAlpine, do you have any empirical evidence that shows qualified immunity isn't actually effective or necessary in any way? A 2017 Yale Law Review article from Schwartz was the author. states that while the Supreme Court calls qualified immunity important to society as a whole, that statement is based on zero evidence. The article goes on to state that available evidence indicates that qualified immunity often is not functioning as assumed and is not achieving its intended goals. Well, I think we can both read that. Maybe we can get, Kent, can you make a note? We need to get a copy of that law review article, and we'll take a look at that. Jimmy Brown, Mayor Snider, I would implore you to connect with TTSD, Superintendent Ricky Smith and her staff, and they had developed a wonderful community-oriented budget process. She has facilitators that are simply put amazing. The process they use to gather input from students, parents, teachers, administrators, community members that were ethnically diverse was quite empowering. Okay, Jimmy, thank you for that feedback. I think we should try to model the SRO discussion. We kind of already talked about that, but Jimmy, you're giving us even more specific thoughts on exactly how to model that discussion, I think, at a minimum. So,
but I will add, over a year ago, actually it's probably been 2 years when I first got here, and we did some outreach. So the school district does have diversity, equity coordinators, and I have been working with them directly on what we can do to improve communication with police and students, students of color. We've actually had some facilitated discussion with, in this case it was the Latino population, with their parents, with translators, and the police department. So there's been some really good work going on already, and we can just continue to improve or add to that.
Thank you, Chief. So Irene has a comment and kind of a question about the SROs being military looking, and could regular officers not look so military sooner rather than later? So this is an interesting conversation, and I have some reflection on it because this has changed during your tenure, and some of that was at the request, I think, of the officers, and it was really more about comfort. But I realize the comfort also makes them look perhaps more intimidating, though that's not really, I don't think that's what they were trying to achieve, but that may have been the result. So I don't know what your thoughts are on just the physical appearance of both the SROs and our officers out on the street.
Well, I was pretty, set on the officers looking how they conduct their businesses, and in the school, again, having all the tools. Again, we're talking about an active shooter scenario, or the fact that sometimes the school resource officers leave the school to help us on a priority, and so having them identified and having all their equipment was important. My mindset was also that, if the students got comfortable, saw past the uniform, got to know the officer, when they saw any of us in uniform, because that's how we would respond to maybe their home or out on the streets, that they would already, that wouldn't be a barrier. They're used to seeing that. Again, I think it's important to be open-minded and listen to the students. If there's a softer way we can do this, in other words, I think one of the thoughts was, could we look more like our bike officers? So again, the external vests aren't there, they're maybe underneath their shirts. So I think I'm receptive to looking and hearing what the students are asking, and then also weighing, does the officer have any concerns of any safety things, which I don't think they will, but so that's definitely on the table.
Okay, and Mike recently learned that Washington County's been using facial recognition software. He finds that disturbing. Can we prevent the use of this software in our community?
They discontinued that today.
Oh, okay.
So again, they saw that national studies, I can't cite where that was, that there was disproportionate were people of color, and so they immediately stopped using that and announced it to all the other agencies. So that came out effective today, and I'm sure Washington County would be the lead on getting into the details of that.
You have me intrigued there. I'm trying to figure out how a computer facial recognition software could be better at detecting. I'll just have to understand that. From a technology standpoint, that's fascinating. That might suggest we've, built systemic racism into our technology, which I would not put past us. But
I think that's a concern, and whether or not the data supports it, but I think there's a concern enough that they're stopping it, and whether they go to study it or do some more, but right now they're just stopping it to make sure they don't contribute to it.
Okay, and Abraham, what are the demographics of the police department workforce, and what percentage of the officers are from the Tigard community? So, great question, and one that I think is really interesting because we are closer to reflecting our community than I thought. In fact, I think Chief, I'll let you go through the specific numbers, but I think the one gap is maybe in the Latino or Latinx community. Is that
right? So our current.
Why don't you go through all of them?
So our Caucasian Tigard population is 73%. We're at 84%. Latinx is 11.7, and we are at 6%. Asian or Pacific Islanders 7.8 in Tigard. We're at 6%. 2 or more races 4.7 in Tigard. We're at 2. Black or African American 2 in Tigard, 2% in the police department. American Indian or Native Alaskan 0.2% Tigard population, 0 that identify in our department. And the percentages of who are currently in our background as applicants, we're only at 56% white or Caucasian and 30% African American. The rest of it is people of color that are currently in somewhere in our stages of our process.
Okay.
So the recruiting efforts have been very favorable.
This question about folks being in our community, like that's an interesting question, and I'll start by answering or responding to some of that. I don't know exactly how many officers live in Tigard right now, but they're and maybe this practice should change. But in the past, when I was a reserve officer, a lot of officers would live like in Sherwood or in Tualatin or in Newburgh or somewhere where they were close and sort of connected to the community, but not living next door to the people that they might have to arrest. And I don't know how that practice is now, but that's been, I think it's reasonable to just call that out as something that was or has been deliberate among frontline officers. But what's it like now?
Well, I've had an opportunity to do one-on-one with all the officers when I first got here, and then I followed up 2.5 years later to kind of take a pulse check. But we have a few officers that do live in this city of Tigard. Others just say I hate to say this, but they say they can't afford to live here, the housing market and whatnot, so they've gone. You're right, they're in the outskirts around, whether it's Sherwood, Beaverton. Some are going more rural and like to go a little bit farther out because they actually want property and land.
Yeah, different.
And so it's a personal choice,
yeah.
And everything else. But some that live in Tigard absolutely like to serve the community that they live in. And then you're right, there are many, and now I'm talking more broadly, not specifically Tigard officers, where I used to live in the city I served, and because I was in the drug unit, saw a lot of people I arrested, I felt like I could never just relax, and so I moved out of the city I had served in so that I could just basically turn it off. And so there are some officers who feel that way again today.
I can remember the first time, I lived in Tigard and was serving as a Tigard Reserve police officer. This was decades ago, but I can remember being in the Albertsons and realizing the guy that I was standing in front of, I was involved in arresting him the week before, and I was like, wow, this is uncomfortable. I wonder if he'll recognize who I am. Anyway, it's just, that's a reality of the kinds of things that our officers face. So Robin Trebold has a question. What is the city intentionally doing to change the relationship between police officers and people of color? That is a wonderful question, and one that is, my summary answer to begin with is that we are starting and embarking on, I think, a really significant listening process. And then, Robin, I don't know if you've been listening the whole time, but from my perspective at this point, the city needs to start with all of the outcomes that are disparate and work backwards as to how we got to those outcomes. So, Chief, I don't know what you've got to share today about that, other than all the work we're just in the process of starting.
Yeah, the pandemic didn't help us as far as your touch points really are if you can get out in the community and face to face. Just having even this platform is helpful. I will share since we've been doing this, I've had people of color come to the police department and talk to me face to face. We've sat out in the outside benches and had heart-to-heart talks for over an hour, and people really, coming and just saying, how can I support the police department, but here's how I feel, and this is what my life's about. And they're very personal, and I appreciate it, because that's how you create understanding and connection. And so we look forward to when we can have gatherings to have those listening. We also contracted as a city with Unite Oregon, and they've been out making phone calls and contacts as best they can with the community about all city services, but we have a few specific police questions. Again, what do we need to hear? And we're just getting that information back. So the best I would say is, or the most responsive we are, is let's listen. Instead of us determining what we need to fix it, is really listening to what people are saying, what is important to them, and then making those collective decisions together. And so that's been our approach so far.
Thank you. So Irene has a question about, I know we've heard of community policing, because we talk about it actually pretty frequently, and Chief, you are all over that. Do you want to take that question? Have we heard of community policing as a structure for the future?
That has been the foundation and cornerstone of Tigard Police Department long before I got here. And one of the things that Mayor, you've heard me and the council's heard during the last couple of years, when growth has come and the calls for service have come, when I have those one-on-one with the officers, they're saying, I remember what it was like, where I could spend 30 minutes talking to somebody about crime prevention, or you can do that, or just even having a conversation, to I feel like I'm just running from call to call. And in fact, somebody was complaining that I felt like the officer was rushed and felt like they had to help me and rush along. So we believe in it, we've seen the value, and we aren't doing it nearly the way we want. And if you look at what the Levy said, that is one of our measurements, or the outcomes of the onboarding of 8 more officers, is that community connection. And we're just looking at how can we measure that. I know one will be a survey, but 2, how else can we measure where officers are maybe staying in their geographic area and making those contacts. So we'll look at how we measure that, and then that would be on our website for transparency. But community policing, that is what attracted me to Tigard, because it was small enough that I felt like I could really talk to people and make a difference in that way, as opposed to a big city and nobody knows your name.
So Tom asked, and we've got 9 minutes left, and questions are hitting heavy and fast. So we're gonna try to move through these. So what are the reasons for doing away with the SROs other than financial? There is no decision right now in Tigard to make that choice, and that certainly that could change the amount of money that we spend in certain ways to police or to help support the school district and the students in the schools, but that's going to be a discussion, and so there is no decision or reason right now. The reason we would do it is because our community, through a broad dialogue, would conclude that it's not the right model for our community right now, but that decision's not been made. Deb asks, how are we handling current protests and keeping things from escalating? I will just answer in short that the various marches and protests that have happened in Tigard thus far have been extremely peaceful and actually attended by members, mostly to either because we were invited. I know our police chief was invited to the event on Monday, and I was invited as well. We're trying to be careful about making sure that we're not, inviting ourselves. And then we also had a couple traffic officers that were helping to make sure everybody was safe on the streets and roads from vehicles.
We didn't over police it. We just, our sole focus was not knowing how big these gatherings would be, is helping them be able to cross the street. So we used with a march of 500, we did it with one motor officer, and then of course a few of us who were just actually participating, but we used just one escort motorcycle to be able to make it safely. And to my knowledge, I've not heard of anybody getting injured in any way, and certainly there was no negative outcomes out of there.
Yeah. So the next two questions, both from Kate and from Jimmy Brown, are about the relationship between the police department, or the police department and the police union. It seems like police unions have vastly more power than other unions. I think we as citizens are very nervous that the police unions are using their power to protect bad apples to the detriment of the community. I would like assurance that the law applies to law enforcement officers just as much as it does to the average person. And then Jimmy has a question, what are the, for the chief, what are the effects of the current labor agreements on policy and infrastructure changes within the Tigard Police Department? So can you comment on both of those?
Sure. I'm very appreciative of the Tigard Police Officers Association, or TPOA. It has been collaborative from the get-go, which was my desire, and I think theirs. We have a weekly meeting, especially when we're talking about levy and other issues, and we talk about things, what is happening. We have discussions. It is extremely cohesive and collaborative. Unfortunately, I've had to make decisions that have resulted in officers being terminated or resigned in lieu of, and the union did what they had to do as far as representing them, but there was no disagreement on what the outcome was. So again, TPOA has a desire also to keep good officers here, and understand that when somebody goes outside the lines, that may go all the way to a termination, that serves all of us. And so they're very connected, and they're not strong-arming in any way. But also, when you're talking about labor agreements, that has to do with wages, working conditions, and things of that nature. That's what's in the labor agreement.
I think it's also important, though, for our community and the broader community in Oregon and even the country to have more of a dialogue about this, because there are a number of instances, this hasn't necessarily happened in Tigard that I'm aware of, but there's a number of instances where a chief and a city have terminated someone for what are pretty, in the police world, pretty egregious activities, and then an arbitrator, months or years later in some labor dispute, reinstates them as a police officer. And I think as a country, as a community, as a state, it may be okay if, the person that's packaging up your French fries is in a union and they get, terminated and are reinstated. I think it's quite another when you have, something that was a result of a use of force complaint or something else, where a city or a police chief took action to terminate someone, and then the department is being forced to take them back. I think that's problematic and concerning, and something that has to do with our laws and labor laws, and not necessarily something that you and I can directly change. Kevin, can we have Officer Nunn join one of these discussions? He is still the president. That was the other question. And we can certainly make that request. Be happy to do that. I talked with him in the last week. Mary Ann, well, I don't know if it's Mary or Mary Ann. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us and clearly doing your research. My question also refers to the SROs. Can you please refer me to the data used to determine that SROs are a real safety strategy rather than a perceived one? So, Chief, is that another research point you can take back if you don't already know the literature on that?
So there have been studies, and you're right. It's the perception. That's where if a child or the students feel the perception is that they're safe, that's a good thing. Same with the staff. And so the last study that I read, and it was probably a year ago, it was heavy on perception. And so you have to decide, is there a value? Because they're so small when you're talking about active shooter type scenarios.
Yeah, you're talking about extremely
Right.
unlikely events, but if they happen, you know.
Yeah, our response time, and when we lost 2 school resource officers because of budget cuts, you heard from both the staff and the students, and it was more, and the parents, that again, just the red availability of an SRO at the school was a comfort to them. But there is research out there that took polls, that dove into the data, and that's the one that I read.
So Dev asks, if the George Floyd situation happened in Tigard, how would you handle it? We actually talked a bit about this last week. We had not, so just a summary of that conversation was, I used the word technique, and you corrected and said that really wasn't a technique. Yeah. I think that was a good clarification. The short answer to that question is that type of activity would have violated many parts of our policies.
Yeah.
It would have, the officers that weren't intervening would have been violating policy. The use of that force was not reasonable and necessary, so it wouldn't have met the Graham versus Connor standard. So you would have had a bunch of policy violations, and I don't know what the Minneapolis Police Department's policies were, but so many of our policies would have been violated. I think the results would have been similar on the outcomes of the officers.
Well, and if that exact scenario happened, besides,
right.
Again, the imploding and shocking the conscience, but just from when we go back to qualified immunity, because we have a policy that says you will not, the officer, more than likely, and I won't speak for legal attorneys, would not be granted qualified immunity.
Because they weren't following.
They were not following our training or our policies, and that's when qualified immunity, would not be there for the officer, and they would have to get their own representation and be basically on their own, and the city would be protecting their interests and defending the case that way.
So Jeff may have the last comment here. He was just, I think, referencing, he'd asked a question about the internal investigations earlier, or reviews, and he just said the internal part of the review is the scary part. He wants to trust our police, but it's hard to when you see so many instances and stories of covering up colleagues. What about an independent review on complaints of misconduct? I think that's going to have to be part of our discussions. I mean, that coupled with this question about citizen oversight is absolutely something that is going to have to be part of our broader dialogue. I think we are about at time, and I don't want to get cut off. We had a question or comment from Eric about Washington County deputy who's now on administrative leave, having become upset and physical with a DWI suspect. Chief, you want to make a quick comment about that?
Other than I got a briefing from Sheriff Garrett and also DA Barton regarding that whole incident. Obviously, the sheriff is reaching out to the community and talking about this. This is not what he wants his correction facility to do, and is apologizing to all of us. And what, they have cameras, what they in play. I'm sure what they're going to look at is how did their internal review go? What missteps did they have or didn't have in place? Obviously, it's a huge liability and responsibility for him, and we as chiefs will have to follow along and see what things are in place. But he's had an open dialogue with us as of recent as today.
So there's a question. We've got 60 seconds, so we got more time than I thought. Sorry about that, community. We don't want to cut this off early, but Facebook cuts them off at 60 minutes, so trying to manage that well.
There is one I saw that I think bears, and that was a question about TriMet.
Yeah, that was where I was going to go.
And the protests. So currently we have 1 sergeant and 4 officers that are assigned to TriMet. And yes, they were put on emergency standby and called in on their days off to not be on the front line. First of all, they're not even trained or equipped to do the protest. They're on the outskirts where there's still the TriMet transportation or some periphery. But we've been in contact with them to make sure that they're safe, they're good, they feel, protected under our umbrella of what we do and don't do as far as engagement. And So they are not on the front line, they're not doing any of the protests, they do not have any riot gear, but they are part of TriMet. They have been deployed down there as their assignment in TriMet. So I just wanted to get that out there.
All right, the next listening session is actually going to be with two of our city councilors next Thursday. That'll be at 6:30 p.m. I believe it's with Councilors Lube and Newton.
Yep.
So they will be live here next week, Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Good night, Tigard.
Thank you.